Mass Effect 3 is the culmination of 3 games and 90 hours worth of storytelling. BioWare had the opportunity to close out one of the most beloved trilogies in gaming, with tons of diehard fans wanting to find out how Shepard and the Normandy crew story ended. Did BioWare succeed? Yes and no. Mass Effect 3's ending is infamous in gaming, and I've made no secret as to how I feel about it in various videos on my channel. But the ending is just one part of the whole game, albeit a very important part. But still, there's an entire game here that needs to be talked about and analyzed. I played Mass Effect 3 Legendary Edition on PC for 2 playthroughs, a Paragon and Renegade playthrough respectively. I played on normal difficulty for the first playthrough and most of the second playthrough, but I ended up going down to easy near the end of the game just to make finishing it a little bit quicker, because this is a big game and it took a long time to finish twice. This review will contain minor spoilers, but nothing too drastic. If Mass Effect felt like old school Star Trek and Mass Effect 2 felt like Blade Runner, Mass Effect 3 looks and feels like a Hollywood action movie. The red and black from ME2 is replaced with blue and black, and the lighting and color correction just feels like I'm watching a blockbuster film. I don't have any experience with artistic design or anything, so this is just my very uninformed observations, but that's the vibe I get from the visuals in ME3. I find it pretty interesting that each game in the series has such a distinct visual style, while also clearly all belonging to the same series. There's a certain dirtiness and grittiness to ME3's world that was sort of present in ME2, but with a much sleeker and slick feel. ME3 is about all-out war, so the down and dirty visuals make perfect sense with the constant battles and horrific atrocities the Reapers commit during the game. A lot of ME3 feels intense, hopeless, desperate, and raw, and I think the visual presentation captures that really well. The cinematic quality that ME2 added returns here, with lots of moving cameras during cutscenes and different angles during conversations. There are some obvious visual shortcomings, like these random people running away from the Reapers, which are all little sprites of Jack for some reason, but the game looks fantastic overall. Mass Effect 1 had a fantastic score, Mass Effect 2 had an even better one, and Mass Effect 3 has one of my favorite musical scores in any game ever. All of the elements that the previous game's music was comprised of are present and turned up to 11. There are also callbacks to the previous games with returning favorites like the Citadel theme from the first game and the Elusive Man's theme from the second. Pulsating and atmospheric synths, dissonant and discordant electronics and percussion, and moody, triumphant, and emotional strings, plus a healthy dose of heartbreakingly beautiful piano. Just perfect. Perfect. I gotta get this shit on vinyl, man. The voice acting is tremendous, and I don't mean in just the quality, which is excellent across the board, except for one very stilted Solarian who admittedly had some pretty bad lines to read. The sheer amount of voice lines and different voices on display across the 40 hours it takes to complete the game is astounding. BioWare pulled out all the stops to make these characters come to life. Side note, I've always seen people express that they prefer Jennifer Hale's performance as FemShep over Mark Mear's performance as Male Shepard. And while Hale obviously gives a fantastic performance as FemShep, I've always been partial to Mear's portrayal, especially for the third game. I think he nails every scene, particularly the more intimate, quiet, and emotional ones. One complaint I do have though is that there are quite a few unskippable cutscenes or in-game conversations, which makes doing multiple playthroughs more of a pain than it should be. The sound design is fantastic. The music swells, the voices shout, the guns shoot, and the Reapers do that thing. Yeah, that thing. I will say, however, I'm not the biggest fan of the way some of the guns sound. I noticed it immediately when I entered combat for the first time, but some of the guns sound almost gooey or gummy, I guess. There's a lack of bass and explosiveness to the shots being fired, as well as an impact sound that I feel doesn't have a real visceral element to it. It's hard to explain, and as the game went on, I got used to the way the guns sound, but compared to ME2, I actually feel like the guns sound a little weaker. In terms of performance, ME3 was actually the most consistent out of all 3 games, at least in the Legendary Edition. I ran into pretty frequent frame rate drops in both ME1 and 2 when trying to play them at 120 frames per second, but in ME3 it really only ever dropped when I was in certain areas of the Citadel. There were a few minor bugs I encountered, like a couple times during the game there were waypoints that wouldn't disappear after I interacted with them, which happened on both my playthroughs in the same spots, and conversation lines would still abruptly end and fade out before the character was finished speaking them, but all in all, no real issues to complain about. Mass Effect 3 has 3 different campaign modes: action, role-playing, and story. In action mode, conversations have automatic replies and normal combat difficulty. In story mode, conversations have manual replies and minimal combat difficulty, and RPG mode is the normal experience where conversations have manual replies and normal combat difficulty. The leap in combat quality from the first game to the second game was pretty sizable, and ME3 kicks it up another notch. There are a lot of guns that you can find while exploring levels or by buying them from various kiosks on the Citadel. Guns each feel pretty distinct from one another, and you'll definitely have your favorites. Aside from the sometimes strange audio design for some guns, they feel really good to shoot as well. Weapon mods are back and are no longer tied to a single gun at a time. Every gun can use every mod you've acquired for that type of gun. Before each mission begins, you can select your loadout of up to 5 different guns, one from each class: shotguns, pistols, submachine guns, snipers, and assault rifles. Heavy weapons are no longer part of your loadout and can instead be found occasionally throughout missions. I think I would have preferred being able to have heavy weapons in our loadout though. ME3 has added a weight cooldown system, where each gun weighs a certain amount, and the more weight you bring into battle, the slower your powers will recharge. This creates an interesting dynamic where you have to weigh the pros and cons of having the weapons you want versus being able to use your powers more frequently. This largely depends on what class you choose to play. My first playthrough was as a soldier, and as such I decided on bringing most of my available weapons with me into battle, as soldiers are more focused on shooting and don't really need to use powers very often. On my second playthrough as a vanguard, I usually only took 2 weapons with me into battle, as I wanted to focus more on using powers like my charge and nova abilities for a devastating blitz combo. ME3 brings more depth to its combat RPG systems than ME2 had. In ME2 you only had 4 skills per companion and were only able to branch skills at the final node on the skill tree. Companions in ME3 have 5 skills and branch off starting with the 4th node, ending with the 6th. So in ME2, each companion had 8 different options for specializations, and in ME3, they have 30. And some of these specializations can really make a difference for both your companions and Shepard. I had one where my squad received cryo ammo at 50% effectiveness, which basically meant that we could freeze half the battlefield, giving us an insane amount of crowd control. And as a vanguard, I took a skill that let me use Nova 2 times in a row, which let me do a massive charge Nova combo. Suffice to say, the combat RPG systems are pretty good. The combat overall feels much faster. You have unlimited sprint now, allowing you to move across the battlefield very quickly and efficiently, and along with a new combat role that lets you avoid damage and enemies when they get too close, Shepard feels more mobile and agile than ever before. You can quick switch between cover, and you can grab enemies from behind cover for an insta-kill in pretty specific circumstances. You can do heavy melee attacks and even perform a melee combo. Well, you could in the original ME3. You can't do melee combos in the Legendary Edition for some reason. I don't see why this would be removed from the Legendary Edition, so I have to assume that it's some sort of bug that was never fixed. Shepard's health bar is now in segments and recharges only up to the last segment it passed. And to heal yourself fully, you need to use a medkit. Medkits also revive fallen squad mates, but you can also go up to them and hold a button to revive them this time around. There are a few turret sections in the campaign that feel straight out of a game like Gears of War or Call of Duty, and like Gears of War, you can pilot mechs at a certain point as well. You can also hijack enemy mechs if you kill the driver without destroying the mech. However, I don't think the game ever tells you this, or if it does, I missed that information because I never hijacked a mech. The 360 version of ME3 allowed you to use the Kinect to issue voice commands to your squad mates, and from what I understand, it actually worked decently well. I know what some of you are thinking though. What the hell is a Kinect? Don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. It's not around anymore. I never had a Kinect, so I never tested it. And while I couldn't find confirmation about it, I'm 99% sure the Legendary Edition doesn't support it. ME3 does have a New Game Plus mode that carries over all your skills, weapons, and mods, and reputation points. Hacking minigames have been removed completely from ME3. Now you press a button, wait a few seconds, and doors will open. The enemy design and variety in Mass Effect 3 is pretty goddamn fantastic actually. You have 3 main enemy factions in the game: the Geth, Cerberus, and the Reapers. Each faction would be enough to carry another game's combat system for its duration, but ME3 has 3 fully fleshed out enemy factions. Enemies have various health types. Almost every enemy has the base red health bar, which is susceptible to every kind of damage. Then you have the yellow armor bar, the purple barrier bar, and the blue shield bar. Each one of these health types are more or less vulnerable to different kinds of damage like weapon, biotic, or tech. Each faction has their own set of enemies ranging from the basic Geth or Cerberus foot soldiers to the big guns like the Cerberus mechs or Geth primes. Each enemy NPC serves a different purpose in the combat chessboard we play on. Cerberus engineers can set down automated turrets which can deal heavy damage to the player, so you might want to eliminate engineers as soon as you see them so you don't have to deal with the turrets. But at the same time, depending on what squad mate you have with you or skills you have, you can hack that turret and make it fire on your enemies instead. For every piece in the combat chess, there's also a counter or multiple counters that can be used to effectively deal with it. Mass Effect 3's combat is excellently designed. Unlike its quest system, which is kind of garbage, it's basically identical to ME2 in terms of its UI, however, it does not give you any actual information on how to complete any quests. All it is the actual quest name and a blurb of what the quest is. Citadel, Cerberus ciphers. A C-Sec officer needs updated ciphers to break Cerberus codes. Find the ciphers and deliver them to him at the Citadel embassy. So where am I supposed to find these codes? There are many planets in the galaxy to look for these codes on, or maybe I'll find them during a mission. I have no idea. Sometimes the quests have a hint, like which system you can find it in, but the majority of side quests have little to no information on how to actually complete the quest. And quests don't update in your journal when you actually manage to find the thing you need for the quest. So if you forget whether or not you obtained the item because you were doing main missions or whatever else, you might have to just go all around the Citadel just to see if you get any prompts to talk to NPCs to complete your quests. It's truly a baffling system that was unnecessarily downgraded from previous games. Scanning planets does make a return in ME3, however you no longer have to launch probes to mine minerals for upgrades. Instead, you scan planets to find things for side quests. That's about it. There is a new system, however, involving pinging planets while controlling your ship to figure out which planets have items on them. But if you ping too much, Reaper ships will come into the galaxy and chase you down, resulting in an insta-death if they catch you. It is pretty easy to cheese it though. Exiting and re-entering the galaxy will reset the Reaper's positioning, so I was never unable to finish scanning the system to completion. ME3 introduces a war asset system, which is tied to your total military strength. As you go through the game completing missions and side missions, you'll gain war assets like certain characters or entire group like the Krogans or Turians, which all add up to your TMS. Your TMS directly affects which ending you get, so having as much TMS as you can is in your best interests. There are essentially 3 different kind of quests in ME3, which I'll call main quests, side quests, and side objectives. Side objectives are the aforementioned planet scanning ones, which feel like chores rather than any sort of actual fun. I did my best to complete as many missions as possible for my first playthrough, but I didn't bother completing the majority of side objectives for my second playthrough. Main quests are self-explanatory. Side quests could almost be divided into 2 categories because some side quests have a big overall impact on the game's story, while some of them feel like repetitive, shallow filler. A decent amount of side quests just take place on the actual maps from ME3's multiplayer and consist of surviving against a few waves of enemies. It's essentially single-player horde mode, and while I don't have an issue with horde modes, I would much rather have more story or character-focused side content in my RPGs than this repetitive content. The original release of Mass Effect 3 had a co-op multiplayer mode, which unfortunately has not been included with the Legendary Edition. In all my years of playing Mass Effect 3, I had never actually played the multiplayer mode before, but from what I've been able to gather, it was actually pretty legit with a lot of content. Bricky made an excellent video on it, which I'll link in the description below. I did boot up my 360 version of ME3 in order to try the multiplayer, however, I was getting horrible lag, so I decided to quit pretty quickly. I understand why the multiplayer wouldn't be included in the Legendary Edition, but it would have been cool to have. The multiplayer was originally connected to your TMS, however, which I think was a decision made in order to try and sell loot boxes to the players, because yes, ME3 was one of the loot box pioneers thanks to EA. ME3 begins 6 months after the end of Mass Effect 2 and the Arrival DLC. Shepard has basically been under house arrest after blowing up the mass relay, which resulted in the deaths of 300,000 Batarians. Shepard is summoned in front of the Alliance's brass as it appears the Reapers have finally arrived and they want to know what to do. Talks are cut short, however, when a Reaper interrupts the conversation by killing everyone except for Shepard and Anderson. Shepard manages to make his way to the Normandy while fighting through the rubble of a besieged Vancouver, where Anderson orders him to go and get help from the Council races, while Anderson stays behind to lead the resistance on Earth. Plans are then discovered to create a device called the Crucible that supposedly can defeat the Reapers, but it needs something called the Catalyst, but no one is sure what it is. So Shepard must gather allies to fight the Reapers while also trying to find information on the Catalyst. Mass Effect 3's story is my favorite of the trilogy for the most part. The emotions are more heightened than the previous two games, with a sense of finality throughout the whole game. And regardless of what choices you make, characters you care about will die, but characters can also die from the choices you make. There's a tangible feeling of underlying tension and desperation throughout the whole game. The Reapers have been built up throughout the trilogy as this overwhelming evil. We were consistently teased and warned about them, and now they're finally here. It's hard to explain the amount of hype I felt the first time I played Mass Effect 3, and even now it's still an awesome finish to an amazing trilogy, again, for the most part. We get to see almost every character that we've encountered in the series and finish their stories. Romances can be continued, ended, or started, and each squad mate that's still alive will have an appearance. Some get bigger roles than others though. The choices that you made throughout the series come back to play an important part in the finale, especially whether or not certain squad mates survive the previous games. Some characters that have a big role in ME3 will be replaced by new characters, like Rex and Morden having their parts in the story played by Reeve and Paddock Wicks. There are tons of memorable moments and a lot of emotion as well. The characters of the Mass Effect trilogy are my favorite set of characters for any game I've ever played, and BioWare mostly does justice in giving each of them a good send-off. ME3 introduces a reputation system that works with the Paragon and Renegade system. Whenever you complete a mission, you'll gain reputation points, which essentially act as a multiplier for your morality points, which still only increase based on your choices. And while again, you do make many important choices throughout the game, your options are actually more limited than they've ever been before for each individual conversation. In previous games, you would almost always have 3 options to respond with on the dialogue wheel, a Paragon, Renegade, and Neutral option. Now you only have 2, a Paragon and Renegade option. I've said in my reviews for the first 2 games that Mass Effect strongly encourages the player to choose to play as either a Renegade or Paragon, because that's how you gain points to unlock Paragon or Renegade conversation options, and BioWare finally acknowledged that by removing the neutral option completely. And there are some choices from previous games that really don't amount to much in ME3, like whether you decided to save the Council in ME1 or who you appointed to the Council. If you chose Anderson to be on the Council, he'll just show up in ME3 like nothing happened, and Udina will be the Council ambassador. I mean, there is a throwaway line about it, but still. ME3 simultaneously gives the player a lot of choices with real consequences, while also being more linear than previous games. There were a few bizarre decisions made with the story, like having Jessica Chobot, who was working for IGN at the time, voice a character named Diana Allers, a reporter that you could recruit for the Normandy. Diana's in-game model looks like Jessica, and having a recognizable gaming figure that worked for one of the biggest gaming sites just felt strange. This isn't the first time BioWare has done this either, as a Dragon Age 2 DLC had Felicia Day in it. There's a book written by Jeff Keighley called The Final Hours of Mass Effect 3, which I bought and read in preparation for this review, which contained a decent amount of information about the game. But I would say that it's actually more about the people who made the game rather than the game itself. But if you're a big Mass Effect fan and haven't read it before, I think it's worth a read, especially since it's only like $3 on Amazon. The book does mention a few things I want to touch on though, like Javik being cut from the game and the way romances were viewed by the developers. Javik is a Day 1 DLC squad mate that was originally intended to be in the game but was cut due to time constraints. At least that's the official story. However, when your DLC is actually released the same day the game comes out, it is no longer DLC. It is content you removed from your game in order to try and make a few more bucks off of your customers instead of actually selling them a full finished product. Javik isn't just some random ass squad mate. He's the last living Prothean, one of the most important races in the entire franchise, and he plays an integral role in the story. If it was truly the case that you needed to cut him from the game, but did end up finishing his content in time, then release it for free as a launch update, not paid DLC. According to Casey Hudson, the romances in Mass Effect were always supposed to be a 3-act structure, where the romance options in ME2 were seen as temptations for a player to cheat on their original love interest. Obviously, things probably changed to some degree, as most romances in the series are done well and have good payoffs. But it does explain why the interaction between Shepard and the ME1 romance options seems so strange and forced in ME2. However, I really think that BioWare did not communicate this well at all to the players if this truly was their intent, as a lot of players like myself were very confused when we were confronted by our ME1 love interest accusing us of cheating in ME3 during our first playthrough of the game, when it seemed like things were clearly over in ME2. Paragon Lost is an animated full-length film set during the events of Mass Effect 2 that follows James Vega, one of your squad mates in ME3. James tells you about everything that happened in the movie during conversations with him in the game, which is basically his whole backstory for ME3. It's a decent film. It's not amazing, and I wouldn't say that it's required viewing, but if you're a Mass Effect fan, I'd say it's worth a watch. I'll give a brief overview of the crew for ME3 now while we're on the topic. Apart from his backstory, there isn't much to James as a character, but that's okay, I think. He doesn't have a standoffish attitude like Jacob had in ME2, so he's at least more likable than him. It just seems like BioWare didn't know what to do with him in the game, which is a shame because they made a whole movie about him, which showcases much more of his character than the entirety of ME3. James can be romanced by a female Shepard. There are a couple of crew members who aren't squad mates but can be romanced, Samantha Traynor and Steve Cortez. They are also the first two exclusively gay romances in the Mass Effect trilogy. Sam is your new communication specialist, effectively taking over Kelly Chambers' job more or less. She's kind of a nerdy, quirky newbie who got thrust into the spotlight with a position on the Normandy and feels a little out of her depth. She does prove herself before long though, and I quite like Sam. She can be romanced by a female Shepard. Steve is your shuttle pilot who is also in charge of maintaining the armory and procurement of supplies. Steve is a workaholic owing to the fact that he's grieving the loss of his husband and doesn't want any time to think about what he's lost. Steve is a sympathetic character, but I do think that the game plays its hand a little early, since you find Steve crying about his husband the second time you meet him. It probably would have made more sense for the player to get to know Steve a little better before dropping that bomb on them, especially if you intend to romance him as a male Shepard, because it does feel a little strange to me to make moves on someone who's clearly still not over their dead spouse. Javik is the aforementioned Prothean you find in a pod who's been asleep for the last 50,000 years. To say he has culture shock when he wakes up would be an understatement. Each game I feel has a standout character. Rex was ME1's, Mordin was ME2's, and Javik is ME3's, which makes the fact that he was originally relegated to DLC pretty sad. Javik was born during the Reaper invasion of his cycle and never knew a time without war or the Reapers. As such, he's a severe and harsh character that really feels out of place in the best way possible with the rest of the crew. James and Javik are the only squad mates in Mass Effect 3 who haven't appeared in previous games. The rest are returning crew members and squad mates. Depending on who survived in Mass Effect 1, Kaidan or Ashley will show up in ME3. They still aren't exactly over the whole returning from the dead and working for Cerberus thing, so they kind of pissed me off more than anything, to be honest. I'm sure you get more out of their characters if you romance them, but if you didn't, they kind of feel like they're just there hanging out when you eventually recruit them. Tali and Garrus both return, being the only characters to be squad mates in all three games, if you don't count DLC. Tali is now an admiral with the Quarian fleet, and the responsibility weighs heavily on her. Seeing Tali go from being essentially a kid on her pilgrimage to an admiral is a pretty satisfying arc for her character. Her story involves finally putting an end to the Geth and Quarian conflict, however that may end. Garrus isn't slacking either, and is now an advisor for the Turian military, as he is the only one with any real experience dealing with the Reapers. Again, like Tali, seeing Garrus go from a disillusioned small-time cop on the Citadel to a high-ranking commanding officer is a satisfying conclusion to his story. Liara returns to the squad as the Shadow Broker, the worst-kept secret in the galaxy. Liara is more battle-hardened and cynical than she was in the first game, but due to Javik's arrival, her old enthusiasm and naivety do appear again, and she has some of the more touching moments in the game. Finally, EDI is now a squad mate as she takes over a Cerberus's bot's body. body. Edie is another standout character in the game, being so unique compared to the rest of the characters. She also begins a romance with Joker, which is surprisingly sweet and endearing. Finally, without going into spoilers, I'll talk about the ending a bit. Mass Effect 3's ending is one of the most controversial endings to any game, period. There was a massive outcry by fans who were incredibly disappointed and let down by an ending that many felt was inconclusive and much too short. Personally, I also don't like the ending, though after replaying the game now after a few years, it's not as bad as I remember it being, but it's still not good. Endings are something that video games have always struggled with, but when you're developing a game that is story-driven and the final game in a beloved trilogy, you would think that the ending is something you would want to nail down as soon as possible to give a satisfying conclusion to all the fans who have invested their time over the years. In truth, there were multiple different endings discussed during development, and the fact that they landed on the one that we have in the game is quite an interesting decision. The outrage was so intense that BioWare decided to develop and release an extended cut DLC, which added more scenes to the ending, which did improve it a bit, but I still don't think that ME3 ended well. I mean, technically there are multiple endings in the game, however most of them are very similar to each other, and even with the extended cut, you still hardly get any closure. Mass Effect 3 had a few single-player DLCs as well as a lot of multiplayer content. However, I'm only going to be talking about the single-player DLC in this video. There was the aforementioned From Ashes DLC and the extended cut, as well as the Leviathan, Omega, and Citadel DLCs. Omega is definitely my least favorite of the bunch. Aria has gone into exile on the Citadel thanks to a Cerberus invasion on Omega, and she wants Shepard to help her take it back. It's a pretty straightforward story with a couple new enemy types that only show up in the DLC, but I don't think it's enough to make it more interesting. You get to spend more time with Aria and encounter the first female Turian in the series, but apart from that, this DLC really doesn't have much to offer. The Leviathan DLC by comparison is much more interesting, with some big lore reveals and an awesome atmospheric suite of levels. Something that Mass Effect 1 did very well was a sense of mystery, which hasn't really been that present in the sequels. Leviathan brings that back and then some, with a heavy Lovecraftian vibe that sets this DLC apart from the rest of the game. The Citadel DLC is one of my favorite pieces of DLC I've ever played for any game. It's basically a love letter to the series and fans, as well as kind of an apology, I guess, for the way ME3 ended. The DLC is essentially 3 different parts. The first one sees Shepard dealing with the new enemy that is trying to kill them, and is more lighthearted and humorous than any other part of the series. Anderson also gifted Shepard an apartment on a new section of the Citadel, and the second part of the DLC is basically a hangout simulator where you get to invite your crew to hang out at your apartment or the Citadel. And the final part is a party at your new apartment involving all your surviving crew members. This DLC is unashamedly all about the fan service, and I can understand why some people might feel it's a bit too much. However, I think that this is an awesome experience to send off the trilogy and these characters that so many people have grown to care about so much. The Legendary Edition is the best way to play the Mass Effect trilogy in my opinion. It has all 3 games with almost all the DLC, minus the Pinnacle Station DLC from the first game, which isn't really a big loss to be honest. It's also missing ME3's multiplayer, which is unfortunate, but despite those 2 omissions, if you've never played the Mass Effect trilogy before, this is the way to do it. Or if, like me, you just want to experience it again, this is a great way to do that. But to finish off this review, Mass Effect 3 is my favorite game in the series. The combat is great and well designed, it has a fantastic presentation with a strong, distinct art style, amazing music, and manages to conclude the stories of the Normandy crew both past and present in a satisfying way up until the ending. The ending cannot be ignored, it's just bad and unsatisfying, but I personally don't feel that the ending is so bad that it ruins the rest of the trilogy. I still love the trilogy and Mass Effect 3, even though I really wish it had a better conclusion. I'm going to give Mass Effect 3 a 9 out of 10. I finally finished the Mass Effect trilogy. Holy crap, this took longer than I expected it to, which seems to be a trend for me on this channel. I do plan on reviewing Andromeda at some point, however I'm not quite sure when that'll happen. The next review will be for Call of Duty United Offensive. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the game. Thanks for watching.